Okay, so we'll, the War of 1812, lots of confrontations. Okay, so what's happening in France right now, or what's happening in Europe as a whole right now, is that in 1812, this is a map of Europe. Okay, what you're looking at is, this is France. Okay, this is actual France. Under Napoleon, this is France. He has managed to take control of everything that you see that's green. So he's taking control of all of the smaller kingdoms of what will eventually be Germany. He's taken over most of Italy and Naples. He's taken over all of Spain. And he has taken over a big chunk of what is going to eventually be Poland, okay? The places in purple are places that he has not taken over because they've agreed to form a treaty with him. So Prussia, Austria, Norway, Denmark, they have signed treaties with Napoleon that allow him to come and go as he pleases. And therefore he has no need particularly to take them over. The only states that are still in resistance are England, Sweden, and Russia. And I want to say, just for the record, that Portugal is technically not, is technically resisting Napoleon, but all of the Portuguese royalty has fled to Brazil. So how they're resisting is not really, it's sort of a passive resistance. So all of these places, the places in yellow are places that are still trying to resist Napoleon's spread. But basically, based on this, he has basically taken over all of Europe. But the British are resisting. So the British are fighting the French wherever they can. And where is the strength of Britain, generally speaking? Where are the British the strongest? Say again? What? In the water, right. The British, their strength is mostly in their navy. Napoleon has a very impressive land force, and he has a navy at his disposal, but he is not a naval general, he is a land general. So he is used to fighting battles on the land. So most of British strength is in the navy, and they do the same thing that they've always done. They go to other French holdings and they blockade those ports to prevent French supply ships from getting where they need to go. Another thing that the British are doing is that they are taking ships from other countries and impressing the soldiers, meaning that they're taking men off of those ships and forcing them to be British sailors instead on their own ships. That's called impressment. And one of the most vulnerable and therefore easiest groups of people to exercise impressment on is the American Navy, because it's already pretty weak. So this whole thing kind of starts off with an event that takes place kind of in the Chesapeake Bay. Now y'all remember the Chesapeake, right? It's all peninsula. There's like a bunch of little pieces of land that kind of stick out into the water. It's a little hard to guard. And it's hard to say once you get out to about here, who's in charge of this part of the water, because it used to belong to Britain. It was the Atlantic Ocean that came all the way to America. So the American Navy hasn't really established much control in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Chesapeake Bay. So right outside the Chesapeake Bay, the British still have ships. And those ships are monitoring all of the trading ships that are coming up from the French West Indies. One of the ships that they have in the harbor there is called the HMS Leopard. And that's HMS His Majesty's ship, I guess. Her Majesty? His Majesty's. The Leopard. And their job is to guard the Atlantic coastline from French trading ships from coming into America. So they're supposed to be interfering with French trade with America out there in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, a thing happens. One of the few ships that America actually has, the USS Chesapeake, is parked in Chesapeake Bay. And the HMS Leopard gets a little too close to the Chesapeake because there is somebody on the docks who is a deserter from the Leopard, okay? His name is Ratford, and he stands on the docks of the port and basically shouts at the HMS Leopard and taunts them and makes fun of them for not being able to get to him, sort of nanny boo boo kind of stuff from the docks. And they decide that they're tired of this, so they board the USS Chesapeake searching for deserters. And the Chesapeake can't do anything about this because they only managed to fire one cannon. They're very disorganized. They only managed to fire one cannon before they're being boarded by the Leopard. And once they get on board, the sailors, the British sailors, do actually arrest 4 deserters. One of them is Ratford. One of them actually was a deserter. But 2 of the other 3 were actually African. Like, they weren't even, there's no way they could have been British sailors because they were actually free African Americans. They were actually freemen. So they take Ratford on board the ship and they hang him. And then they return the other 3 to American shores. But during that episode of boarding, arresting, and completely basically ignoring the sovereignty of the captain of the USS Chesapeake, they managed to seriously insult America. So Jefferson imposes an embargo. He says, episodes like this are why we can't have nice things. And he imposes an embargo and says, as long as the French and English and I guess, the Russians and whoever else are fighting with Napoleon in France, America's not going to trade raw materials with any of them. Nobody is allowed to trade with anybody that's involved in these Napoleonic wars because we just don't want to participate. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen to America if it's illegal to trade with anybody who's involved in the Napoleonic Wars? Smugglers, definitely there's going to be smugglers, but barring the actions of smugglers, what's going to happen to people who manufacture these goods, who harvest these raw materials? Yeah, they end up with a massive supply of raw materials built up with nobody to sell it to, and the economy of America suffers as a result. Very specifically up in New England, because the New England industries are very targeted towards the British. They're shipping lumber, timber, things like that, the things that the British are buying in large amounts right now because they're building ships. And now suddenly it is illegal to trade lumber with Britain, which means that they can't sell their timber, which means that Britain can't make its ships. But all of these industries up in New England are very unhappy about this. Wines, rums, food products, grains, all of these kinds of things that America has been growing successfully as cash crop colonies. They've been growing these things, are now states, and their biggest exports they can't sell because of this embargo. So it only lasts about 15 months, and during that time, New England becomes very, very unhappy with the Jefferson administration. They actually become really, really bitter about this embargo. Meanwhile, in the Ohio River Valley, we're going to talk for a minute about this character, Tecumseh. Okay, so during the Revolutionary War, Tecumseh was born and grew up seeing his villages being destroyed one after another. As he was a child, he was moved from one village to attack to another. He fled and moved to another village, and then that one was attacked, and he fled and moved to another one, and then that one was attacked. He was born in 1768, and you have to dig back a little ways to remember that in 1776 is when the Revolutionary War started, but the fighting between British forces and Native forces in the Ohio River Valley goes back that entire time all the way back to the French and Indian War. It goes back a long way. So he spent his whole life watching people burn his villages. So he grows up very bitter and very anti the British, but also anti the US. The soldiers that actually attacked his villages are now the Americans. During the time they were allied with the British, but now they're Americans, and so he's very anti them. He has, at 15, he began to negotiate with the British forces that are still in the Ohio River Valley to purchase weapons so that he could harass Americans who were trying to build settlements out there. He didn't believe that they had any right to be settled in the Ohio River Valley. The treaty that ended the French and Indian War supposedly gave that land to the natives, and just because they have a new treaty at the end of the Revolutionary War doesn't mean that his people have actually moved. They're still sitting there in the Ohio River Valley trying to defend their villages. So he joins a movement that's led by Little Turtle. It's called the Wabash Confederacy, and it's basically an attempt to take all of these little tribes and unite them. The Miami, the Illinois, the Shawnee, all united under a single military force. Regardless of their origins, regardless of their any differences in their cultures, to unite them into a force which then can move the American settlers back out of the Ohio River Valley and take over. In a battle in 1794, General Mad Anthony Wayne, the U.S. general, attacked this confederacy, Chief Little Turtle's confederacy, and defeated them in less than an hour. When that happened, they had been encouraged to withstand that attack with the promise that if they got into trouble, the British from their forts would come and help them. So the British, who are in forts they're not supposed to still be in, promised that they would assist if Little Turtle and his forces stood up to this American military incursion. But what actually happened is that after an hour, when they were defeated, they fled back to the British forts and found all the doors locked. So the British were not going to be there to help them. As a result, Little Turtle had to negotiate a treaty with the American military forces called the Treaty of Grenville, because they lost their support from these, rogue British forts. So they had no choice. Little Turtle negotiated the treaty, but there's something we have to understand, and that is that the way we envision negotiating a treaty, putting all the power of our whole country in the hands of a single leader who then, negotiates a treaty, is not the way it works in most Native American societies. Most Native American tribes don't even just have one chief. They have multiple chiefs for multiple purposes. They might have a war chief for a specific war, and that's the extent of their power. Their whole leadership authority is just for that one war. So there's really no way to negotiate a treaty with an entire Native American force. The best you can hope to do is to negotiate a treaty with some of the leaders and have others not really, mind so much that treaty was signed. So there's nobody whose signature was actually, Little Turtle was not powerful enough to actually have a treaty that everybody else had to abide by. And so Tecumseh refused to sign the treaty. It ended this war in the Ohio River Valley, and for roughly $20,000 in goods, they sold large chunks of the Ohio River Valley and promised to move away. And as part of this treaty, America promised not to take any more land. Important point, yes.
Is that like that time $20,000 or this time $20,000?
It's equivalent to now, $20,000 now.
So they just gave him like a Toyota Corolla?
Basically, yeah. In exchange for, do I have the number here? Most of Ohio. Yeah, most of Ohio. And the promise that they wouldn't come back. And they wouldn't expend into, they wouldn't take any more land in Ohio. Any more of the Ohio River Valley. So Tecumseh saw this as a big betrayal. He thought, this is sad, this is ridiculous. Tecumseh also had a little brother. His little brother's name was Lalawethika, which means loud noise. And part of the reason for that was because Lalawethika grew up seeing all these same things that Tecumseh saw. He saw all the same horrors, he saw his village getting burned. And as a result, he was an extremely anxious young person, like traumatized. So he turned to whiskey. He became addicted to whiskey and became a drunk. At one point, he walked into a tree because he was so drunk that he couldn't see where he was going. So he walked into a tree and poked out one of his eyes. So one of his eyes is gone. It's not evident in this picture. It's just one of his eyes is just closed in this picture. But he is actually blind in one eye because he was so drunk he walked into a tree branch. He was so drunk, in fact, that in 1805, he fell into a stupor so deep that people thought he was dead. And while they were preparing him for burial, he had a vision. And this vision was essentially faithful Indians riding happily in a game of honey, in a land of honey and game, a place where they could freely collect food and where they could freely hunt and where they were free of all the influence of white people. They were just gone from all of that. He saw this vision of a place where that was possible. And when he woke up, he took that prophecy and it became part of his name. His name was Tenskwatawa, the open door. And he became what was known as the prophet, Tenskwatawa. So he and his brother established a little, sort of a headquarters where they gathered followers. They went from tribe to tribe and they told of Tenskwatawa's vision. They encouraged the natives to give up using the weapons of the European cultures, give up using muskets and start picking up bows and arrows again, start using their traditional weapons, their traditional fighting style, and their traditional lifestyle, but for goodness sakes, give up whiskey. You stop drinking at all. So they gathered followers who were the remnants of those battles that had happened, who were looking for, stability and guidance and a new vision of something positive for the future. And very quickly, Prophetstown became a place that was tens of thousands of people. And they were mostly living peacefully, tens of thousands of people living around this one area, but it was an awful lot of strength gathered in one area. So in 1811, William Henry Harrison was a general, signed a treaty for 1.2 million more acres of Ohio. Okay, and that 1.2 million acres of Ohio was outside of the original Treaty of Grenville. So even though that was part of the treaty not to take any more land, they signed a treaty taking over 1 million more acres. When that happened, Tecumseh went to the people of Prophetstown and gathered a force of warriors and went around recruiting from all of the other tribes outside of Prophetstown as well, and built an army specifically to go to the governor's house, Governor William Henry Harrison's house, and force him to give back the land that he had just signed the treaty for, force him to sign another document that would give the land back. While he was gone, William Henry Harrison actually marched on Prophetstown. So just so you get that clear, Tecumseh gathered a force of arms to go to the governor's house and force him to sign papers that would undo the treaty he had just signed that gave them all this million acres. And while he was gone, this governor marched a force to Tippecanoe, which was right outside of Prophetstown. Tecumseh had left specific instructions with his brother. If Harrison does something like this, if he marches on Prophetstown, evacuate. If he starts to march towards this encampment, leave. Don't engage. Do not engage. But Tecumseh had a vision that claimed that if the Native Americans, if they fought and they used their traditional weapons to fight, then the bullets would have no effect on them. That they could not be hurt by Harrison's forces. And with that vision, which he preached to Prophetstown, a force of warriors raised up out of Prophetstown and went and marched to meet William Henry Harrison's camp. So Harrison fortified his camp, didn't fire, just fortified his camp, and then waited. And then the Tenskwatawa's forces, the warriors that were inspired by his words, converged at Tippecanoe, attacked Harrison's camp, and began to take fire. And as soon as they began to take fire and realized that the bullets hurt, they fled. Okay? So the warriors went back to Prophetstown and confronted Tenskwatawa, who basically said, I was confused because of my wife. He blamed his confused vision on the fact that his wife had confused him. So Harrison gathered his forces and marched from Tippecanoe to Prophetstown. And when he got there, Prophetstown was deserted. And he went back to Washington and said, I have had this massive victory at Tippecanoe. So William Henry Harrison, basically, I just want you to get a good idea of what happened here. He was in his camp, his men were in his camp. Suddenly, they were surrounded by warriors. They opened fire, the warriors fled. They followed the warriors back to Prophetstown and found Prophetstown deserted. And they were like, we win. And that is the victory of Tippecanoe. Okay, it became a part of William Henry Harrison's name. He was called Tippecanoe, William Henry Tippecanoe Harrison. And later when he runs for president, it will be the nickname he uses in his campaign, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. But this is the victory that he had, was that they attacked, realized they weren't bulletproof, fled, and then evacuated the battleground so that he didn't have to take Prophetstown anymore. So all of this upsetting situation with the natives in the Ohio River Valley, Madison, who is now the president after Jefferson, James Madison was elected, and James Madison is also a Virginian. James Madison is also a strong states' rights guy. He comes from the same party of Jefferson. He basically took over for Jefferson. He blames all of this uprising amongst the natives on the British. He says the only reason that they felt like they could ally was because the British are providing them with weapons. The British are arming the natives. At the same time, they're sort of reveling in this thing where Lewis and Clark went all the way to the Pacific Ocean and came back. And they recognize that they are in a position where if they want to, they could take all of Canada, or they think they are. So he has a couple of different rallying cries here. He says the British are arming the natives, and he says on to Canada. On to Canada is one of the rallying cries of this battle. And he declares war on the British. He believes that they can win because, among other things, America has invested in new naval forces. America's new Navy. And it's kind of a shady thing that they did, basically, knowing that in a couple of years, it's going to be illegal to import slaves. They have really invested a lot in fast-moving ship technology. Ships that can travel fast over short distances and ships that can be resilient over long distances. They've really built up their Navy quite a bit. So he has this new Navy, and he has Lewis and Clark's vision of we got to get forces all the way out to the Pacific Ocean so that we have feet on the ground so that we can claim that disputed territory out there. And now the British are arming the natives. So the Americans declare war on the British. And we are now in the War of 1812. Okay, the first thing America always does at this point in their development when they are declaring war on the British is go up the Hudson and into Canada. They always try to take Quebec first. That's almost always the first thing that they do. An interesting thing happens here where one of the commanders, William Hull, actually goes up into Canada and begins to circulate a proclamation. And that proclamation, I won't make you read it, but the proclamation basically says, you residents of Canada, you're oppressed just like we were oppressed. We used to be under British rule, and you still are. Come and join us in our freedom. If you just lay down your arms and promise to be Americans from here on, then we'll all be brothers together, and this is an army of friends coming to liberate you. However, if the barbarous and savage policy of Great Britain be pursued, and the savages are let loose to murder our citizens and butcher our women and children, this war will be a war of extermination. So that's his proclamation to the people of Canada. Oddly, the people of Canada didn't react well to it. Apparently, they thought that was kind of insulting. So that really just made them madder. So everywhere in this northern theater that they went and fought, everywhere that they fought on land, they did badly. Everywhere that they fought on land, they had to deal with the descendants of French fur traders, the Allied natives, all of those things that you saw in that one clip that I made you watch of guerrilla fighting and attacks like that. Everywhere that they fought on land, they did badly because everywhere they met resentment, everywhere they met resistance. Everywhere that they fought on water, they did pretty good. Anytime they actually attacked on water, they did pretty good. They frantically built more ships, and they got those ships up into the Great Lakes as fast as they could, and they let loose their one big secret weapon with ships, which is, what is it American ships do when they can't fight face to face? They hit and run. They turn into privateers. They turn into pirates. So they let loose the privateers, and they let loose the smugglers, and then they managed to basically take the Great Lakes because they have control of the water. Meanwhile, the natives actually have their own miniature civil war because their original resentment was against the British US forces. And now the British and US are fighting each other. And so they have to decide, are they going to come in on the side of the Creeks, especially have to decide whether to come in on the side of the British or to come in on the side of the Americans. And they are split on this question. And so the Creek people actually have a whole civil war of their own to decide which side to support in this war. And the ones that decide that they're going to fight with the British against the US call themselves the Red Sticks. They paint their weapons red and they paint their faces red. They put red stripes on their faces and they identify themselves as the Red Sticks, and we will see them again later. So I just want to make you aware that British and US forces are trying to ally with natives, and the natives don't always agree on which way to go. And so they both end up with native allies fighting against each other. Something really unfortunate for America happens in 1814, and that is Napoleon is defeated. Napoleon stretches out into Russia. He actually attacks Russian forces in Poland, and then the Russian forces go, oh yeah, and then run into Russia. And Napoleon chases them into Russia, stretching out his entire military across this massive land, which basically spreads him too thin, which allows all of his enemies to gather in a big circle around him. And so he ends up being defeated and exiled to the island of Elba. So Napoleon is actually sitting on an island while his forces have fallen apart. So Britain was busy on land fighting with France, and now they're not. Say what? When he went into Russia? Yeah, he had tried to attack Russia in the winter, which people should just really not do. I don't know why that keeps happening. It happens again in World War II, and it's a mystery to me why people think it's a good idea to attack Russia in the winter. Anyway, but yeah, he was defeated because he made this ridiculous decision, which is a bad idea, which Hitler will do again later, the exact same thing. So anyway, Napoleon's been defeated, which means the British are now free to focus all of their attention on this battle that's happening in America. And it stops being a conversation about let's continue to support our native allies in the Ohio River Valley, and starts being a conversation about, hey, this is a great opportunity for us to take our land back. Britain is going to get America back under British control. You know, that embarrassing thing that happened in the 1780s, we can put that all behind us and we can bring these rebels back under British control. And the orders that they have are essentially to leave spare only the lives of unarmed Americans, not their houses, not their towns, not their holdings, just their lives. So the force that marches into the Chesapeake, that comes into the Chesapeake, is there for destruction. It's a destructive force. So in 1812, the naval blockade cuts off trade in Chesapeake Bay. They also raid down the coast, and they begin freeing slaves from the coastal plantations. Freeing meaning that they basically say, if you want to leave your plantation, you can come with us and join our fight. You can be a part of our military. You can be part of the British military. They didn't free them just so that they could leave. They freed them so they could join. And as free soldiers and sailors, they were able to serve with the British military. About 4,000 of them were freed in this manner. So the British actually recruited military forces from among the slaves on the plantations. In August of 1814, they attacked Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C. was a relatively new capital, but it had a lot of symbolic meaning because it was, you know, it was the first capital that was not established by luck. It was established by choice. It was the treaty agreement between the North states and the South states. It had a lot of symbolic meaning. The family, the Madison family, the president and his family actually managed to flee Washington ahead of this. So they didn't actually manage to take out the president, but they did set the White House on fire. And they burned actually most of the Capitol public buildings. This, by the way, is the only time in US history when the Capitol building has been occupied by foreign forces. The closest we can say since then is January 6th of this year, when for a couple of hours, the Capitol was occupied by rebel forces, I guess. So that's why people keep bringing that up in the news stories about what happened on January 6th. This has never happened. This never happened. The Capitol has never been taken over since 1814. It hasn't been taken over. That's true. This was the only time that that happened. But it was really violent. It was not as violent as it could have been, though, because actually there was a tornado. There was a thunderstorm so severe in the Chesapeake Bay that it actually overturned British ships and managed to actually put out some of the Capitol fires. Yeah, a lot of people viewed that storm as proof that the British were doing something they shouldn't be doing because the storm actually stopped them from advancing, but it also took out a lot of buildings in Washington, D.C. I mean, it was a massive tornado. It picked up cannons and dropped them on the British forces, killing both British and American forces at the same time. Boom. So there was this massive storm. So it only lasted 4 days because while the original plan was to take this campaign of destruction inland and start, tracing the American people, they were actually stopped by this major storm. So that's cool. In retaliation, or not in retaliation, but their next step was to raid several major strongholds on the Chesapeake Bay and on the coastal areas. They marched a force on land across to one fort, and they sent a force by sea to another. And it was while they were attacking Fort McHenry that they were trying to take the biggest fort in Baltimore, which would have given them unfettered access to the entire bay, basically, which would give them unfettered access to the bay and also to the land behind it. And they couldn't take it. They tried and they tried, but Fort McHenry had just been fortified, like in the years before. It had just been fortified with all the best of everything. And so no matter how hard they tried to bombard it, they couldn't take it. At this moment, it just so happened that a man, Francis Scott Key, was on one of the British ships trying to negotiate for the release of a British captive, a doctor friend of his who had been treating British wounded soldiers while in captivity. And they had agreed to because they were so grateful to this doctor, they had agreed to let him go, but not until after they were done bombing Baltimore. So he actually managed to be standing there as a prisoner in the bay on a ship, watching as the British ships tried and unsuccessfully to attack this fort. While he was watching, they raised their flag, which was a huge, oversized flag, and the British took that as a taunt. But actually, they did that every morning. They raised their flag every morning. But in this particular instance, having had the bombs coming at them, the cannons firing at them all night, for them to raise their flag in the morning as though they were still in charge of this fort. That's where the inspiration for the Star-Spangled Banner comes from. This is actually, Francis Scott Key was actually watching when this happened, and what he saw inspired him to write the Star-Spangled Banner. So y'all want to talk about the Star-Spangled Banner for a second? Okay. Let's get into our primary source document here, maybe. All right. I haven't lost y'all yet, have I? Zoom, can you see what I'm showing you?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
So what we see in the Star-Spangled Banner, let me get it open over here. Yeah. Okay. What we see in the Star-Spangled Banner, and this is the handwritten one, Francis Scott Key actually wrote on the boat, but here's what the words to what he wrote. He's actually looking at the shore. On the shore, dimly seen through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes. What is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals and discloses? He's talking about the flag, specifically about the vision of the flag. It catches the gleam, it reflects, it shines. It's the Star-Spangled Banner, oh long may it wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. This third verse is the one that gives people some trouble. Where is that band which so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more? Who is he talking about? Does anybody want to guess? Who is he talking about being the band who swore that after the war we would no longer have a country? Yeah, okay, but Britain, but specifically, no refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. Who's he talking about there? Right. He's talking about those 4,000 plantation slaves that joined the British forces on the promise that after this war was over, there would be no more U.S. and that they would be under British control and free. So he's talking specifically about them. Now, Francis Scott Key was himself definitely not an abolitionist in any way, shape, or form. I would say he's pro-slavery, but he was like, yeah, that's the system. That's the reality of what works. So basically, he took it as a personal insult that slaves would desert their plantations to fight for the other side. And the question that he's asking in this verse is, where are you guys now? Your blood has washed out their foul footsteps pollution. They're dead. They joined the British. They fled from their plantations and joined the British for the promise of freedom, and now they're dead. They're dying in this assault. So it is kind of dark. As a who was it that was in the Zoom that was saying that this was kind of dark? Yeah, we've lost whoever it is. Okay, whoever it is, we've lost them. Okay, so that's the Star-Spangled Banner.
That was me, Professor.
Who's me? Just so I know.
Andrew.
Andrew. Okay. All right. Cool. So that gives you just a little more context of what we're talking about here. I will say that while it is kind of gory, the French Revolution one is way worse. And at some point, y'all should definitely check that one out. Okay, so Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. They were never able to take Fort McHenry, and they actually repulsed the British forces much easier than they thought they would. Meanwhile, in Europe, Napoleon having been defeated, Napoleon is imprisoned in 1812, and he escapes from the island and raises a new force and is defeated really, really quickly. So like he tries one more time and he's defeated. And after that's over, all of the major European parties decide to come together and talk treaty, talk peace. So all of the monarchs and all of the rich, wealthiest members of the countries, or the rich, wealthiest members of France and England, come together and they decide that the way to have enduring peace is for them to agree on where the borders are and keep them, and no more people stepping over each other's borders, which won't last because they'll end up in world wars anyway. But one of the things that they convince England of is that you need to give up America. You need to stop taking back America. Especially the Tsar of Russia convinces Britain, we are not going to continue to be your allies if you don't let go of America. So just let it go. And as a result, they basically redraw the borders right where they were. They signed the treaty on Christmas Eve in 1814, but nobody tells the forces in America. So the forces in America go on and fight. The British forces and the American forces have one more battle after this, about 18 days later. Even though they've said, okay, we're signing this treaty. America can have America. They can have the states that they already had. They can have what they had before, which is all of this. And from France, which is all of this. And from France, they can have the Louisiana Purchase, which they already have. They can have it all back. It's fine. But nobody told the British forces in America. So 18 days later, they had one more big battle, and that was the Battle of New Orleans. A lot of people point to this battle and say, this is proof positive that the American forces were able to take on the British and win. But I want to make sure that we're clear on what exactly happened in this Battle of New Orleans. So essentially, what happened is the British wanted to take control of the Mississippi River by taking New Orleans. America has control of New Orleans because they bought it in the Louisiana Purchase. Britain wants to take New Orleans. The New Orleans coast is protected by cannons and the port is protected by US gunboats. But the British decide that they can get around that by digging a big canal. They dig a big canal with the intention of marching their troops in like a tunnel, like a trench. They decide to march their troops in, they march their cannons in with a trench. And then what they'll do is cross over in one great big wave. They'll go over this big trench and walk right over all of the American forces, which are weak and haphazard. That's their plan. They dig a big canal from their holdings, from land that they control, and then they march in their forces, and then they come out and they march across that canal and they raid on the field. They meet America in battle and defeat them. That's the plan. Couple of things they didn't take into consideration. One of them is Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson has ridden south from where he was fighting in the Ohio River Valley. And the whole time that he's been riding south, he's been gathering forces. He's been gathering the remnants of American allies among the natives. He's been defeating the Red Sticks, and he's been gathering the remnants of all of those forces. He's been gathering people from the western parts of the states, so that want to fight but have been chased out of the Chesapeake Bay, but they still want to fight. So he has been gathering this massive force that the British aren't really paying attention to. So he parks his force on that battlefield and waits for the British to cross it so that he can face them. He's ready. So first of all, they're going into a battlefield where it's not as haphazard as they thought it was. It's actually a bigger, more angry, resentful force than they realized, under the leadership of a very good general, Andrew Jackson. The second thing is they forgot their bridges. Okay, so part of the plan was that they were going to lay these great big planks down and cross them to get across this trench. Two things happened. One, they tried to dig a trench in Louisiana. Has anybody ever tried to dig a trench in Louisiana? Can you guess what happened to the trench?
Flooded.
It flooded. It was a swamp. They were trying to dig a trench in a swamp. So they couldn't actually get their forces in any closer than they basically started on the port. They ended up at the port. They couldn't get any further inland because the trench collapsed under the weight of the swamp water. It's Louisiana. And then their one big plan for getting across this trench was to lay down these big planks, which they forgot. They left them on their ships in the bay. So what actually ended up happening is that Jackson and his forces ended up watching while the British crawled across a swamp to attack them on a battlefield. And that's the Battle of New Orleans in a nutshell. Now I'm brushing over some details and I'm summarizing some stuff. If you really want to look into this, you probably should. It's one of the funniest things. It was such a definitive victory for America that it was humiliating to Britain. It was after they'd already signed the treaty. So the Battle of New Orleans is basically closing the door on any future action by Britain. You're never going to come back here and be embarrassed like this again. So, the end of the war. They signed the Treaty of Ghent, but the fighting with the natives continued until about 1817. They still had little skirmishes with the Red Sticks. They fought the Battle of New Orleans after signing the treaty, and they have a whole new crop of war heroes. Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, Zachary Taylor, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams. Those are all war heroes of this war. Did the names mean anything else to you? Anybody else know what else that list is? They're all people that will become president at some point. These are all presidents. And they went from on to Canada to we didn't lose anything. They went to we're going to conquer the British and take over all of North America to hey, we kept everything we had at the beginning. So those are the legacies of the War of 1812. That was, well, they started off with this on to Canada, like rallying cry, and then they were like, not an inch gained or lost. Yay. The one other legacy of this war, besides Britain once and for all losing its hold on the colonies, is that the people in the New England Convention were going to secede over the embargo of 1807. They were going to secede long before the South ever thought of seceding. They were going to leave the US. The northern states were going to leave the US at the beginning of this war. And they had marched down to Washington before Washington was attacked to hand that letter to the president, but he wasn't there because he had fled because Washington was going to be attacked. Now that they've won the war, the New England Hartford Convention is like, we didn't mean anything by that. We didn't really want to leave. What are you talking about? We don't even know what you're talking about. That's not a real thing. That will come back and haunt them later. Any questions? Okay, your assignment, I'll give it to you as fast as I can because I know we're out of time. Your assignment for today is to answer this question that I've posted on the Star Spangled Banner. The first, we usually only sing the first verse of the Star Spangled Banner, and it ends with a question mark. Okay, you ever notice that it ends with a question mark? We don't sing it that way, but it does. It ends with a question mark. So your assignment for today, I'm not ambidextrous enough for this. Most of the time, only the first verse is sung. The first verse ends with a question mark. Why, in your opinion, does it end with a question mark? Do later verses answer the question? And what do you think is the answer to the question? Okay, so that's y'all's assignment for today. Any questions? All right, I'll see you on Friday.
Thank you, Professor.
All right, y'all have a great evening. It's morning still, so y'all have a great day. Bye.
So as I was walking in here, I heard meowing from that train over here in the parking lot.